Okay. Susie, you want to bring in Mark Schwartz's presentation? I have to, somebody's got their speakers on.
I just unmuted myself. This is Mark Schwartz.
Okay, did you turn off your speakers?
My speakers are not on, no.
Okay, great. Okay, we're all set then. Mark is on the line. I'm going to tell you first how I found Mark, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Mark apparently gave a presentation at the annual meeting of the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, which apparently made a big impression on the people that attended that meeting. And so that stimulated me to find him, because it's very difficult really to find someone who has a comprehensive understanding of climate change, and particularly in its implications for plant communities of California. And I saw that he had been doing work in the Southwest, and I asked him if he's doing similar work in California. It seems so that he has been. So he's a plant ecologist working on climate change adaptation strategies for forest management. He's working in conjunction with the Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks right now. He's a professor in environmental science and policy and director of the John Muir Institute of the Environment at UC Davis. And Mark, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Richard, and thanks for inviting me here to talk today. So I'm going to go through, well, it's a bunch of slides, and some of them are going to be fairly detailed, and hopefully you can access some of these resources online afterwards if you're looking for more detail on some of these particular pieces of information. So this last year, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a body that brings together literally hundreds of climate scientists, has released their fifth assessment for climate change. And they've changed slightly the way they project and future potential climate. And you'll see maps in their publications, which are all available online, things like this graph on this slide, where on the x-axis you have cumulative total anthropogenic carbon dioxide, in other words, how much carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, and on the vertical axis, then how much temperature increase we expect. And what this really shows is that there is a simple linear relationship with a little bit of variability in it, that pink shaded area, around how much gas we put in the atmosphere and the temperature we expect. And the different scenarios for the future revolve around different particular models, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also how fast we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so these different pathways, these different colored lines in this graph show how far we might get by the end of the century in terms of warming. The black line shows what we've done so far in terms of increasing carbon dioxide. We know that it passed 400 parts per million this past year, and the amount of warming that has come as a consequence of that increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So, lots of people say, well, yes, but is climate change really real? Well, the point I'd like to make, and the reason I like the way these graphs show climate change, is that this idea that heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere make the planet warmer isn't new. That Svante Arrhenius in 1896 basically worked this out. He described the functional relationship between carbon dioxide gas and heat-trapping capacity of the atmosphere. And so we've known it for more than a century, and that other people during the 20th century, Callender in 38, also described how this could fundamentally change the climate system, although at that point they were worried more about us going into a new ice age rather than future warming. And it was until 1975 and Walter Brecker that suggested that this burning of fossil fuels could actually lead to a warmer planet in the future. And then Charles Keeling, starting in 1958, has really been documenting that rate of carbon dioxide increase into the atmosphere. So we're not uncertain about what carbon dioxide does to the capacity of the atmosphere to trap heat, nor are we uncertain about how much carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere. And so the point is that this isn't really unsettled science, and that there is some unsettled science, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's not that human activities are going to cause something on the order of this scale of warming over the next century, that adding CO2 generates warmth. And that the manifestation of this is abundant and found at all different scales. And so off to the left here you see changes in average temperature in California from 1950 to 2000, and these red bars represent around deeper red colors represent from a quarter to a third or more of degrees of heat, of increasing temperatures per decade. And so we're increasing temperatures at a fairly rapid rate, but there's some spatial distribution around that warming. On the right side, we see more global pictures that we're losing Arctic summer ice content. We're increasing the ocean heat content. We're increasing sea levels. That at all scales we're getting changes in climate. So that part isn't really uncertain either. And I like to point out that we really need to be thinking about it this way, that the upper right picture is a picture of Earth from space, and you can see that light blue line that's our atmosphere, that this warming happens in the troposphere, that we have the tropopause, and then in the stratosphere, that's where we're actually getting a signal of heat that's being lost to space. And so one of the things we've observed is a stratospheric cooling with global warming, because that troposphere is more efficient at trapping solar energy into the troposphere, and as a consequence has been warming. And that this is an incredibly thin veneer. Richard's sitting in Dixon, and that troposphere is about the distance between where Richard's sitting in Dixon and where I am in Davis. It's less than the distance across from north to south on Lake Tahoe. It's just not very thick, and we're putting carbon dioxide into that. The graph on the right just represents the amount of warming that we've had over the last century or so. And so this is a kind of a complex slide here, but it shows three things. One, we can measure that heat-trapping gases are increasing, and there's a variety of them, but I'm just focusing on carbon dioxide here today. Two is that busy diagram in the lower right, and that represents these global circulation models that include variation in solar energy, variation in cloud cover, variation in how land surface albedo changes the amount of heat trapping, atmospheric pollution, volcanic activity, et cetera, that these models are trying to capture all of that information to build a model of how climate might change. And the graph in the lower left represents, the black line represents what climate has actually done. The blue line represents what we think climate would have done had we taken out all of the anthropogenic forcing, all of the stuff that we've done to the atmosphere. And the pink lines are putting the changes in things like sunspot activity and solar energy along with those anthropogenic factors such as increasing carbon dioxide. And so you see that the observations actually fit the model at a global scale fairly well. Nevertheless, these global circulation models are at incredibly coarse spatial scales, and so they tend to miss local phenomena. And this is a point that is very important in thinking about managing forests. So the prevailing view is that of every global circulation model is that California is going to warm by 1 to 7 degrees during this century, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. However, there's a lot of phenomena that are very important to the climate of California that aren't well captured in these models. So, for example, the marine layer and how onshore flow of marine air influences our climate is not something, it's at too fine of a spatial scale to be captured in these models. Well, we've had several recent cool summers, and John Largier out at the Bodega Marine Lab has observed that longshore winds and coastal upwelling, which decreases coastal sea surface temperatures, has been something that's been ongoing for about a decade. And so is that a decadal oscillation, and that will swing back into another pattern soon, and that will be the end of those cool coastal summers? Or is this actually a manifestation of climate change, and that it's going to result in higher longshore winds? I'm not sure we know the answer to that yet. And so as a consequence, we can have surprises at a local scale. So global warming can mean, in fact, places on the planet that actually get cooler. And so I put this as a plant ecologist concern because that's what I am. I'm a plant ecologist. I don't know the details of all these climate models. It's just the sorts of things that I worry about when looking at them in doing my science. So this is another one of those very busy graphs, and what it shows is that there are lots and lots of groups that are modeling climate at a global level, and that we can then clip those projections down to California and compare what we expect temperatures to be at the end of the century relative to 1950 to 1980 baseline. And some of the models are warmer and wetter, some are warmer and drier, et cetera, but they range in predictions from 1 degree to 7 degrees warmer, and even perhaps more concerning is from about 25% drier to about 25% wetter. And with respect to forest condition, this is the sort of thing that we really worry about because those are very different futures for us with respect to forest growth. The ensemble mean, it represents the mean of all of these models, and that they suggest about a 3.5 degree change, of which we maybe have already had half of a degree of change. And that those ensemble means actually represent relatively little change in total precipitation, although we see lots of things that suggest that the distribution of that precipitation in rain and snow, and maybe even the seasonality of it, may change quite a lot. And we are, of course, in the throes of a very strange winter with a very strange distribution of precipitation now. And so putting those things together, we may be interested in thinking about how temperature and moisture interact. And so there's a measure called the climate water deficit, which tries to capture how dry the soils are in the summer during the dry period. And the picture on the left is California, and we can see that down in the southwest we have very dry areas, and up in the northwest, southeast we have dry areas. Up in the northwest we have very wet areas, and the Sierras come out as a very wet area. The diagram on the right represents variability, interannual variability in those measures. And so if you look down in that southeast, you can see on the left that it's very dry, and the low amounts of variability on the right graph show that it's consistently dry. And similarly up in the northwest, it's very wet and consistently wet. But there are some areas that have high variability, particularly along the southern coast of California. And again, the Sierra Nevada. So the Sierra Nevada is a place that's very wet, but highly variable. And that is becomes an issue in thinking about forest growth and forest condition into the future. And so another way to look at this is thinking about how much we project the change in future climate to be relative to the amount of variability that we get now. So here on the upper panel are the amount of climate water deficit that's projected in the future. This is one of the worst case scenario sorts of models on the left, and a less dry model on the right. Both of them are about 3 degrees warmer. The bottom graphs represent the variability, and you can see that by the time you get into the red and orange colors on those graphs, you're talking about 2 standard deviations away from the mean. So these are models that are projecting places like the Sierra Nevada to be about 2 standard deviations drier than they are now, which suggests that we're going to have strongly shifting vegetation, and as a consequence of that dryness, strongly shifting fire regimes. So that's the one concern is the climate change. And the next concern that I'd like to integrate into this is thinking about forest change in response to climate change. And this diagram, it's not very important, but I'd like to point out that all it is ecological data from pollen in lake cores in the eastern United States, and it shows the movement of hemlock, in this case, back up into the upper Midwest and up in the Northeast following the last glaciation. Those small numbers represent thousands of years in the past. The main point is that species are responsive to climate, and that they will change in the distribution as climate changes, and that we need to be mindful of this in thinking about managing forests, as we're now expecting to generate as much climate change over the next century as we've experienced in the last 12,000 years, and that this we should expect to have impacts on the capacity of landscapes to support forest growth. The third major concern here is in fire. We know that as a consequence of fire suppression, that more and more of California has been burning on average over the past couple decades. The diagrams on the left represent total burned area and average fire size. I put these pink bars on there just to show that since 1980 we've been increasing in both of those. 10 of the 13 forest fires that have exceeded 150,000 acres in California's recorded history have happened since 2000. 9 out of 10 of these are caused by people. The 10th one we just aren't sure about. And then up on the upper right, of course, is the boundary of the rim fire this last year. That fire and forest management should be foremost on our minds. And so working with the Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, we went through something that we call a vulnerability assessment, asking where on the landscape are areas exposed to change as a consequence of climate change, of high fire probability. And we'd like to be able to predict this with respect to disease, pests, and pathogens, but that's much more difficult, and we don't have good models for doing that. We'd like to think about the sensitivity of these systems, the likelihood that exposure to these drivers of change will result in a forest cover change, and also think about adaptive capacity. How flexible are our species like ponderosa pine or lodgepole pine to those kinds of changes? How much change can they tolerate? This is a framework that's been adopted by the IPCC in thinking about all sorts of climate change vulnerability, and it's something that's working its way through all the natural resource management agencies. This guidebook on how to do this is called Scanning the Conservation Horizon, and it is co-sponsored and co-authored by many of our public agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service. And it's what we've been doing with the national parks, is to think about national park management with respect to those variables. And so the way we think about this is the following. So fire exposure, what do we need to know? Well, we'd like to know something about the current condition. That would mean fuels or the fire, and also the fire return interval departure, or how long it's been since it's burned, which should have something to do with the fuels. And there are a couple of models from the fire labs of the West that allow you to characterize fuel distribution. We'd like to think about potential fire severity, and fire severity may be a function of the topography, the cover, and the fuels that are out there, and there are models to help people estimate what potential fire severity under different fire weathers might be, and you can use FlamMap or Farsight to do that. But we might also want to include how climate change may drive the propensity of landscapes to burn in the future. And that's really measuring how fires have been distributed with respect to that climate water deficit variable that we talked about earlier, and how that changes into the future. And so there's a couple of researchers, Tony Westerling at UC Merced, Max Moritz at UC Berkeley, that have provided models on looking at potential future fire. And I'll talk about about those for just a minute. But here's a map of the Sierra Nevada and east and the Cascades up to the California-Oregon border. And it maps the fire return interval departure. And what the fire return interval departure is a measure of how frequently we think a particular community type is likely to burn, and then how many years since it has burned. And so for those areas that have very low frequency fires that burn on the order of 50 to 100 years, if they haven't burned in 50 or 100 years, they would have a departure interval of 1. If it's a type like low-lying grassy areas or oak woodlands where we think that they have very high fire return intervals every 5 to 15 years, they might have a fire departure that's very high. And so the red colors are these areas that haven't burned in a long time and that have a high fire return interval departure. And so we have a landscape that's very susceptible to carrying fire as a consequence of not having had fires in there for a long time. Now, of course, this is a very coarse look at this. This doesn't take into consideration fuels management, which you'd also have to look at stand densities and other sorts of things. So that you can put all of that information into these fire simulators, things like Farsight and FlamMap, to try and get better predictions that include things like the estimates of fuel, along with physical features, slope, aspect, and elevation, to look at what fire might do in that landscape. It requires a weather model or a set of weather conditions under which a burn happens. These are the same sorts of models that are used to predict what's happening to a fire as it's burning, and how we might deploy fire management resources. And then there are these climate change fire models, and this is a map from Tony Westerling, and this is that climate water deficit map up in the upper right. But these three diagrams in this figure 5 here are all projections under different climate models of the change in fire likelihoods in California. And once again, you see that there's a consistent projection that those areas that are wet now and are likely to increase in fire carrying capacity through time. So it isn't a happy-looking future with respect to managing forests. It's going to be a challenge to manage under these conditions. And so then there's this issue of vegetation change, and Chris earlier talked about seed zones and getting the right seed and the right trees for your planting, and that has been the model that we have used now for decades, but one that will be increasingly challenged as we see more climate change. So this is depicting work from Sally Aiken at the University of British Columbia on whitebark pine, a species of conservation concern for them. The lighter gray shaded areas represent the current distribution of whitebark pine up through Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. The darker areas are where a species distribution model suggests that whitebark pine will thrive by the end of this century. So more of the climate change has been experienced earlier at higher latitudes, and there's expected to be more climate change at higher latitudes. And so the Canadians with long, slow-growing trees are in fact more concerned about this issue earlier than we have been in the U.S. But they've started trial planting of whitebark pine, those black dots, all the way up to the north border of British Columbia, asking what would be the potential to increase the populations of whitebark pine within a climate change context. And so the point of this slide is that there are people who are experimenting with planting climate-smart, climate change-ready forests already. This idea that if you're planting something that you're expecting to grow in a landscape for a couple hundred years, you might anticipate what that climate might be out into the future when doing the planting. Well, here in California, we have to overlay that with changes that we've already seen that have been principally driven by other kinds of changes. And so this is a series of maps put together by Jim Thorne, where he looked at these historical forest plots that were collected in the 1930s, are called Wieslander plots, and defined them by wildlife habitat relations community types. And these are lots of different colors. The main point is that those plots of the 1930s relative to that same community classification under current changes quite a lot. Namely, the light green that's on the left practically disappears, and that's ponderosa pine. And what you see is the purple expanding, and that's mixed hardwood conifer and mixed hardwood forest, that we see an upwards movement of hardwoods and a collapsing of these ponderosa pine forests. And now that's largely been driven by fire suppression and land management types, and not so much by climate change, but we should expect these kinds of changes to continue. So one of the ways that we might think about this is to model how we expect climate change may drive forest change. And I want to spend just a few minutes on this, but there's many different ways you can do this, and there are resources out there that can help guide what kinds of planting you might do that is climate aware or climate smart. And so Dominique Bachelet and others have used these dynamic global vegetation models. And what they do is they take general forest cover types and project what those forest cover types might be into the future. So here's a projection that they did several years ago for California. And what are the notable things that you see here? That the blue area, the alpine, subalpine forest, is disappearing as those areas warm. The light green mixed evergreen forest expand in the Pacific Northwest and up in the Cascades, off the north end of the Sierras. But this is done at a fairly coarse scale and looking at the distribution of forest types relative to climate and projecting different forest types. A different approach would be a very species-focused approach. And so here's a paper from Yucca brevifolia done a couple of years ago in southeastern California, where, again, the green areas represent potential future distribution. The red areas represent historical or current distributions where the species is currently found that might no longer be habitat in the future. And then there's a slight zone of overlap where they're currently found and might also exist in the future. But this is Joshua Tree, and it's suggesting that Joshua Tree might be in trouble in Joshua Tree National Park, for example. And so one could take a species-level approach at looking at communities. David Ackerley at Berkeley has been using a logistic regression approach. This is this idea that there are some environmental variables across which you either don't find a community, and then you do find a community, that we can think about many environmental variables that predict this sort of thing, and then predict the relative likelihood that any particular place in the future would be a redwood, Douglas fir, or some other type, by putting in fixed layers like the soil type and the soil depth and wind speeds and other sorts of things that we know about locations, along with these variable layers of projected future climates. Working with the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks, we've been taking a slightly different approach, a very simple approach. This is the southern Sierra Nevada here. The gray dot over on the upper right is Mono Lake. And this forest type is ponderosa pine. And what we did was we mapped all of the distributions of ponderosa pine currently on the landscape, then drew contours around that distribution based on climatic variables in a multivariate climate space, and then asked what happens to those points as you move forward in time and project those points with their future projected climate. And those red points represent then places on the landscape that are currently in a cover type, in this case ponderosa pine, that are projected to be in the future have climates that are outside of any known current occurrences of ponderosa pine. And so those we would think as being vulnerable to change. And so this is a project that this is our landscape over on the right with Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon outlined within this what's called a protected area centered ecosystem. But this has been a collaboration with the Park Service and the Forest Service and the Geological Survey and university folks to try and understand how you might manage forests given what we know about this information. And so it's a matter of thinking about exposure, as I mentioned earlier. What's the probability of fire given amount of climate change? What's the probability that fire is high, given that you have a fire, what's the probability that it's high intensity? What's the probability that vegetation will be under stress given climate change? And then what is the probability that the combination of climate change and fire may lead to vegetation change in the future? So, as I mentioned, we're trying to incorporate all of these attributes into this work. And so here's a screenshot of some of Max Moritz's work looking at the probability of a change in fire for this landscape through time. Over on the right, it's for a particular type where the gray area represents, the gray bars represent the fire probability in any one location in any one year. The gray bars representing the current distribution of probabilities. The brown on the top and the green on the bottom represent potential future probabilities based on different models of future climate. And in both cases, you see roughly a doubling of the probability of a fire happening or carrying through that landscape. But we've also done this with the vegetation, and I just went through a model of that a couple slides ago where we have the entire landscape built into this climatic multivariate space. We can identify individual cover types down here in the lower left. We then can contour those the probabilities of occurrence based on where those points are in that climate space in the lower right, and then project future climate onto that map and ask what happens to the potential for those types to persist in that environment. So we can do that for any one type, like ponderosa pine, as I showed earlier, at 4 different periods in time, and we can think about that then with the entire landscape by plotting all of the different vegetation types in that landscape. And what we see is that by the end of the century, a lot of that map turns red. Now that means that we're projecting a lot of the landscape to be outside of the vegetation types that they're covered with now. Now, sometimes this might suggest a large change in the cover type from something like a mixed hardwood forest to a chaparral sort of environment. Other times it's a relatively modest change from one coniferous type to another coniferous type, but nonetheless we should be expecting lots of forest change. And so in thinking about restoring or replanting forest sites, we should be thinking about what kinds of forests are likely to thrive and persist into the future, what kinds of forests may be more resilient to fires, and so that we can plant things that succeed. So just to finish up with us with this project that we've been working with the national parks and the national forests, that we recognize that there's lots of issues out there. And so we have, in this map, we show across the bottom, we look at fire in lots of different ways, the fuels that are out there with the FRID, a model of severity, a model of the number of ignitions we observe, and then changes in fire likelihood through Max Moritz. We, on the top, think about portions of the landscape that look like they might be end-of-the-century refugia up in the upper right. These are those green areas that are within their climatic polygons by the end of the century, and therefore you might think are more secure, or those things that turn red early in the 21st century that are exposed early on. And we also have something we can call magnitude of change. But the idea then is trying to put all this information, including critical habitat for species of concern like the Pacific fisher or cultural values, into a model to say where we should be trying to manage forests to retain what they have now, and where we might manage forests to foster change into a new community type given climate change. I'm just going to skip by this. This is just to say that we aren't certain about what kind of climate that we're going to have in the future. So we've been thinking about a future that might have more ignitions or fewer ignitions, that might be much warmer and much drier, or warmer and wetter, and how that might result in this case, different fire regimes in the future. And that we've been going through the process then of taking those different scenarios for the future and asking ourselves, if that was the future we'd have, how would we deploy our fire management resources? And so this has been an interactive planning exercise with lots and lots of people talking about what are the different potential futures that we might be faced with, and how can we devise a management regime that would be relatively robust to all the different futures that we might reasonably expect to observe as we move through the 21st century. So conclusions, that this has been a process of trying to include the decision makers in this process, and that's one of the keys to success. And I don't need to go into these details, I don't think, for us today, but it turns out that in thinking through this planning, that feasibility, where we can and can't deploy fire management or fuels reduction, is a huge driver in what fire management is likely to happen. So we think about how would we use this information into the future. And so in thinking about restoration. So Chris earlier talked about seed zones. The seed zone map here is the inset on the left. Many of you may recognize that polygon on the right. I showed it a little bit earlier. This is the boundary of the rimfire. And that earlier map I showed of the boundary of the rimfire was really a measure of intensity of that fire. So there are places within the rimfire where there was nearly 100% total canopy mortality. There's other places where there was relatively low canopy mortality. What I'm showing on this graph is those portions of that landscape where our model has suggested that there will be exposed early on in the century. In other words, that the cover type that was there just before this fire is not likely to be a cover type that will persist through the end of this century, in that that by the end of the century we expect climates that are outside the polygons or outside the distribution of climates where we see those types of forests now. And the green areas are those areas that are not like that, that by the end of the century, they will, whatever cover type was there prior to the fire, that cover type would still be within its climate envelope by the end of the century. And so you can look at using tools like this to think about where on the landscape you might want to manage for change or manage for persistence of things that you already have, and that this might be a way to frame forest restoration and replanting. Just to give a nod to Malcolm North and some of the other folks of the Forest Service that have been doing a lot of work on trying to think about forest resilience and fire, that we ought to be mindful of reducing fire risk given a landscape that is likely to burn more in the future. And one of the things that they've been working on is these variable stand density, that we think is much more like the natural forest cover of the Sierra Nevada, where you may have areas of very high density trees that may provide habitat for those species that require that. But you also have areas that are fairly open, and that having this variable stand density can help reduce the risk of high intensity fire over large portions of the landscape. And so it's not just what we're planting, but how we plant it in terms of the spatial distribution of forests on the landscape that's important to think about with respect to changing climates and water stress and fire risk. So what's next in terms of our work? We've been expanding this approach from the Sierras to now also think about this with respect to all the forests of California. So we have models that are available for that. I want to go back just for a moment and say, David Ackerley's group, Dominique Bachelet's group, our group have all been working on these kinds of models using different tools at different scales. And so there's a number of people that can be approached that would have information to help guide somebody who is trying to adapt a planting strategy for a changing future climate. And so with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions and comments. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Mark. Boy, we have a slew of questions here. Maybe we can start from the top. Susie, you want to bring the questions into the view of everybody? And I think we have to move down here a little bit to get to the first one that's relevant to you. And let's see here. I'm moving that down, but Susie, maybe you should move it down. I'll keep my hands off there. Brent McDermott has been having actually a conversation in the chat box with others about reforesting a 40-acre burned area. And he's asking about what the best species mix would be at 5,500 feet, Jeffrey versus ponderosa pine. He also had a question about the relative drought resistance of the different mixed conifer species. And actually, that's a question. I don't know if you want to address that or not, Mark. That's something we can address. We have some information on that. Susie and I can respond to that later. We can, if Brent will give us email address, we can respond to that later.
Yeah. So, I don't want to address this issue of relative drought tolerance of individual species because I'll just say something that's wrong by doing it on the fly here. But I think I can address this question with respect to things you might think about with respect to replanting, and there are these. One, seed seeds are far more vulnerable to climate than seedlings, and seedlings more vulnerable than juveniles and adults, and that adults are more tolerant of climatic stresses than others. And so it may be that, and we're talking about a 1 to 7 degree change in climate over this next century. And if you think on any given day, that there's what's the variability of temperatures that we might experience as high temperatures or low temperatures today? Well, it's more than that 7-degree range. And so on a sort of a daily basis, we're moving around within that window of variability. And so it's not sort of immediate chronic stresses that we're likely to be experiencing in trees, but sort of this long, dry periods and drought over long periods of time that we're really, I think, worried about. Extreme events become very important to think about in terms of projecting what you should plant. But that oftentimes, if you think about a traditional silvicultural approach to forest management, and I don't know if that's what you're doing, but we're often planting a higher density of trees than we expect to have there in 15 years that we're going to go through and actively thin. And of course, a strategy would be to plant a mixture of things, and then you have the capacity to watch and see how climate is changing and how those species are performing in that area, and adjust the management down the road. So, we're already seeing places where this idea of site typing is starting to fail for us. That if we use site typing as a guide for what we should plant in the future, we have to bear in mind that those forests were often initiated a couple hundred years ago under a different set of climate conditions, and they might have initiated under a short period of time that was particularly wet or particularly dry. And so planting some kind of mixture it seems like a good idea. So talking with folks who are responsible for some of this reforestation in the rimfire, people who've been working on planting in the Stanislaus and other national forests. Partly it's a matter of practicality, like Chris alluded to earlier, that there's a lot of seed that just isn't available. But partly it's a strategy to begin to mix seeds from different seed zones, to bring in seeds from a warmer seed zone in anticipation of those trees having the capacity to tolerate warmer, drier conditions, and that might be a management strategy that one would take.
That kind of rings true with what we've heard also by Joe Sherlock in one of the opening presentations about out of seed zone planting experiments that were initiated by Mike Landrum from the Forest Service, and that have been followed up now. And there's quite a few places where the Forest Service is actually doing that, and they actually now have a sort of a working policy of planting, I guess 500 feet above or below, I can't remember which, out of range on their plantations. So people are trying to do this now. Malcolm North's work, of course, is also instrumental in what their new planting strategies are. We've already responded to Brent's comment about drought tolerance. Rich Walker, who works for Cal Fire FRAP program, asking about concerns about the vulnerability of old-growth giant sequoias, and that the Converse Basin was all red.
Yeah, so this is a big issue, and I think it's a complex issue. And so our analysis turns that basin all red, turns many of the groves red, as a matter of fact. And as a consequence, the national parks have invested into more detailed information about the hydrologic regime and droughtiness of different stands. So, there's a few things that we have to bear in mind when thinking about things like sequoias. One, those sequoia groves that are there have been there for, at a minimum, 2,000 years, because some of those trees are 2,000 years old. And if you look at tree ring data or paleoecological data from the Southwest, we know that there have been multi-decadal droughts far worse than what we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years during that period of time. And those sequoias persisted through those droughts because they're there. And as a consequence, we may expect that to happen in the future as well. And so I think that there's two things to be worried about with respect to something that's like sequoias. One is, do we move the climate system to a point where there aren't enough protracted periods of relatively cool, relatively wet weather where you get successful regeneration? And so we end up with museum stands, right? Museum stands where the trees are surviving, but we're not getting any reproduction. In which case, we'd want to start thinking about where might be the future of sequoias and where would you want to initiate grows. But that is a problem that we have many years, more than our lifetimes, to fix. So it's something we have to begin to watch for. Probably a more germane conversation to have over the short term is what is adjacent to these groves and how vulnerable do they become to damage from fires moving through the adjacent landscapes. And so this is the conversation that we are having with the people at Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, and that gaming was really focused on those sequoia groves. Is what sequoia groves are you going to invest in fuels treatment and manage fire, and which ones are you not, and which ones, and do you do that just in the grove itself, or are you managing around the grove as well? Because if you have stands that that are surrounded by vulnerable types that experience a fire and then all of a sudden is reestablished as chaparral, well, that's a game changer for that sequoia grove. And I think that we want to be thinking about how you manage groves to keep them resilient from a catastrophic fire, a high-intensity fire during a very dry period. And that's probably the biggest short-term concern.
Okay, we had a couple other questions here, but it's more of a commentary on, planting hardwoods versus conifers and fire resistance or resilience. I think it's sort of the devil's in the details on that. I mean, anything that's too dense is going to burn. And we have, at UC, when I was working with UC, and I think Susie would concur, it's how the stands are managed more than it's the composition of the stands as to whether they're going to be able to resist an oncoming fire. I think some of the work that was done at Black's Mountain, which was sort of accidental. I mean, they had done fuels treatments, and then the fire came along and came through, and the areas that had undergone fuels treatments, regardless of the species composition, they were able to resist crown fire, and actually the fires dropped down to the ground. And even on the rim fire, I think the majority of that landscape did not crown, as I recall. Is that right, Mark? I mean, I think most of it was underburning.
Yeah, I think most of it did not crown. There were some areas where there's, and maybe they made the news, had very high intensity crowning fires, but an awful lot of that was in Forest Service land where they had very dense stands of trees that had been planted in the 70s and 80s that hadn't undergone stand thinning and sort of silvicultural management the way you might in a production forest, and as a consequence were more dense than you'd want and had those ladder fuels that you have to burn very hot.
Yeah, Susie's been working on the rim fire, doing outreach down there, and she's mentioning that the high severity fire percentage was 40%. But I don't know whether that's severity in terms of mortality or severity in terms of the bare measure of soil response. So,
right.
The severity, you have to think about what's being defined there.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, in terms of vegetation mortality. So it was in terms of mortality of vegetation.
Yeah, and I guess you might expect, increased, that number to go up somewhat, not on severity, but on mortality, given that there will be trees now that are also stressed that will take some time to die. But yeah,
okay.
So I think this is where I think that the main message there is that that stand management and fuels management still is probably the principal driver in thinking about how you manage a forest to be resilient to things like fire and droughts and disease, but that all of that requires also thinking, at least in the back of your mind, about that future climate and how that changing climate is going to increase stress to those forests.
If you look at the latest surveys that the Forest Service has been releasing recently about insect, problems, that seems to be dramatically increasing as well. So we have all sorts of things kind of converging at once here.
Yeah, it's a very harrowing thing, that there are lots of places in the West where there have been major beetle outbreaks and major pathogen outbreaks, and although we have white pine blister rust and some other problems in California, we haven't yet experienced mortality of trees from massive outbreaks of insect pests the way other parts of the country have. And wow, watch what happens when that happens, because that will create a lot of fuels out there on the landscape for fires.
Okay, Brent's got a question here also about, and I'm not sure you want to handle this one either. Would you recommend lower basal area stocking requirements for the future, and can you give some examples? And I think that's sort of one of the heart and soul of the variable density approach, is that you have different basal areas depending on what the site would seem to be, supportive of.
Yeah.
One of the things the Forest Practice Act has is these, stocking standards. They 200 basal area or whatever it is, and that kind of flies in the face of variable density.
Yeah. Well, so it depends what people are managing forests for. I mean, this question does, tempt me to move outside my comfort zone, since I'm not a forester, and so, I couldn't cite for you any basal area stocking requirement for any particular stand, and so knowing whether to recommend lower ones would be reaching a bit. But I think if you think about general principles, that that basal area stocking numbers are probably driven by a vision of production forestry, of producing timber off of lands, and that if we're not concerned, if that's not our primary management goal, then deviating from those stocking requirements would seem to be possibly a good idea, and that variable stand density certainly reduces potential for high intensity fire, but it also reduces the potential of insect and disease spread through stands, and it also reduces the potential for drought stress, and that those things all go hand in hand. And if we think that the future is one with increased intensity, severity, and length of droughts, and one where we have increased frequency of non-native pests and pathogens, and one where we have increased fire likelihoods, then doing anything you can to reduce the risk of those things moving through a stand would be beneficial to management, and that may include lowering the basal area stocking requirements.
Okay, so I don't know if we have any more questions. Maybe we can wrap it up at this point. Very stimulating presentation. Mark, do you mind if people harass you by contacting you through email?
No, that would be fine. And I don't remember if I put my email address on that presentation, so I guess we can send it out.
No, it was there. For those that wanted it, it was on your picture, and also then your presentation. And if you have any publications you'd like to have posted on the website, just send them over to me, and we'll get them uploaded.
Okay.
There's your contact information up there.
Oh, yeah.
Back on the screen, and I think we're probably good to go at this point. Everybody's probably hungry.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, thank you for hosting this, and great.
Okay, so Susie, you want to wrap it up?
Sure. I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in the webinar. I wanted to draw your attention to the slide which advertises our webinar next week, which will be some case studies of reforestation on burned areas, one on the Plumas National Forest with Ryan Tompkins from the Forest Service, and one on private forest lands. We have Bob Renierson from WM Beatty and Associates, so that ought to be very interesting. So please think about coming back. At the bottom of your screen, you should see the web links, and those are live links. So all you need to do is highlight it and then click the Browse To button, and you should have your browser open to our resources handout page. We have Chris Zimney's handout about how to get seedlings in California. We have the Reforestation webinar homepage. Someone was asking about oaks, and there was a little bit of discussion about oak propagation in Rich Maravich's talk last week, so you could check that out. Then we have our online evaluation survey, so if you'd be willing to click on that, and that would help us out a lot. So with that said, I'm going to thank everyone for coming and stop the meeting audio and hope to see you next week.